Chapter X: The Public Movement and Culture of Russia. In the 30th-50th of the 19th century, 42. Formation of ideal flows and the public movement of the 30th-50th anniversary. Nicholas I.'s struggle with the ideological influence of the European bourgeois revolution occurred in the middle of the XIX century. The process of breaking up and ousting old feudal serf relations with new, bourgeois capitalist relations was reflected in the formation of the worldview of the best people in the country. The ideas of the French bourgeois revolution, freedom, equality, brotherhood, under Russian conditions resulted in revolutionary democratic demands for the abolition of serfdom and the overthrow of the autocracy. The attitude toward these basic questions was determined by the rather diverse ideological trends that distinguished Russian social life in those years. Nicholas I fought the revolution not only with the help of military and diplomatic means in Europe, not only with open repressions, exile and arrests in Russia, but also with the help of ideological means. Revolutionary, advanced ideas and theories. The Tsarist government opposed the theory of official nationality. Its formulation was given by SS Uvarov, who was from 1833 to 1849 Minister of Education. This theory argued that the Russian people by nature are religious, are always faithful to the Tsar and consider serfdom to be normal. This was the meaning of the Uvarov formula: orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality. The theory of official nationality contrasted stable serf Russia with a decaying West. This reactionary theory was deeply hostile to the advanced ideas of its time and was in fact the platform of reaction for justifying the brutal struggle with all advanced and revolutionary ideas and people during the reign of Nicholas. Mugs of Stankiewicz and Curzon. Peasant uprisings in Russia and the bourgeois revolutions of 1830 and 1848. In Europe, the progressive question of Russia raised the main question: what is Russia waiting for? In what direction should its social development go? The center of ideological and political life in the 30s-50s was the Moscow University, where many future talented writers and public figures studied. In the early 30s in the Moscow University was organized a circle of a young student philosopher Nikolai Vladimirovich Stankiewicz, a man of high education and a deep mind. Members of the circle were fond of the German philosophy of Fichte, Schelling and especially Hegel. Chernyshevsky wrote about Stankiewicz's circle: these people resolutely lived only in philosophy. Day and night they talked about it when they came together. We looked at everything. Everything was decided from the philosophical point of view. Some representatives of the Russian educated noble society closely studied the political theories of bourgeois scientists and philosophers, trying to find their answer to the question of the ways and prospects for Russia's development. However, advanced public figures, mainly from among the revolutionary democratic youth, were not satisfied with this departure to the field of abstract ideas. They demanded the transition from abstract philosophy to political activity and propaganda of the ideas of socialism. The circle of Curzon and Ogaryev was the expression of the interests and requests of this part of the advanced youth. Members of the circle of Curzon considered themselves children of the Decembrists, called to continue their struggle against autocracy and serfdom. A.I. Curzon, 1812-1870. Alexander Ivanovich Curzon was born in 1812. His father was a wealthy Russian landowner Yakovlev, his mother was a Württembergian native Louise Haag. Their marriage was not legalized, and their son received the surname Curzon, from the German word Herz, the heart. Curzon received a wonderful home education. The richest library of the father was a source of knowledge for an inquisitive and capable boy. The seminarian teacher supplied Curzon with revolutionary poems by Ryleyev and Pushkin. The thoughts of Ryleyev deeply sank into Curzon's soul. The execution of Pestel and his comrades finally awakened the childish dream of my soul, wrote Curzon about the influence of the Decembrists on him. In 1825, Curzon met and for the rest of his life made friends with the future poet Ogaryev. During one of the walks in Moscow, climbing the Vorobyovy Gory, They gave the nibble oath to sacrifice their lives for the revolutionary struggle. This oath they remained true for the rest of their lives. Entering the Moscow University, Curzon became the center of a circle of revolutionary youth, but was soon arrested and was in exile for several years. Returning to Moscow, Curzon, like Belinsky, joined in active literary and journalistic activities. Lenin wrote about Curzon of that time. In Surf Russia in the 1840s, he managed to rise to such a height that he rose to the level with the greatest thinkers of his time. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 18, pages 9-10. In 1847, Curzon went abroad. He traveled through revolutionary France and Italy. The Revolution of 1848, Curzon met in Paris. Another outstanding Russian scientist, Jacobi, 1801-1874, discovered electroforming. He built the first electric motor. His electric boat in 1838 carried passengers on the Neva. Half a century later, such an invention appeared on the Thames, provoking the astonishment of contemporaries who did not suspect the existence of the long-forgotten Russian invention. In 1834, the Russian mechanic Cherepanov in the Urals built the first Russian locomotive of the original design. However, for a long time, locomotives to Russia were still imported from abroad. At the end of 1830, the famous Russian astronomer Vasily Yakovlevich Struve, 1793-1864, founded the famous Pulkovo Observatory near St. Petersburg. In the first half of the XX century, an outstanding scientist N.N. Zenin made major discoveries in the field of chemistry, setting a stage for the Russian chemical school. N.I. Lobachevsky. In the field of medicine, the famous Russian surgeon, scientist and teacher Nikolai Ivanovich Pirogov, 1810-1881, famous for new methods in surgery and anatomy, became famous. In 1856, Pirogov, in the article, The Questions of Life, spoke out against the old education, demanding the creation of new people with honest democratic convictions. One of the greatest naturalists of the first half of the XX century. The founder of embryology Karl Baer worked in the Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. He launched energetic activities to study the natural resources of Russia, made a series of trips and took an active part in the establishment of the Geographical Society with the Ethnographic Museum under him. In 1819, 1821 years, Russian expedition Lazareva rose to the southern latitudes, opened along the way many new islands and, breaking through the ice, came to the shores of Antarctica. The honor of the discovery of this southern continent belongs to the Russians. In all the latitudes of the Pacific Ocean since then, there are scattered islands with Russian names. The island of Suvorov, the island of Kutuzov, the strand of Beware, at the beginning of the XX century, made a major step forward in Russian historiography. Even in the reign of Alexander I came, history of the Russian state, Karamzin, which was a big event at that time. According to Pushkin, Karamzin discovered Russian history, like Columbus America. However, in the History of the Russian State, written by Karamzin, the ideology of the feudal landlord clearly manifested itself. In Karamzin's opinion, in history, everything depends on the will of the autocrat, who, like a skilled mechanic, gives the move to the masses through the movement of the finger. Literature. During the period of the disintegration of old feudal serf relations and the growth of new feudal relations, capitalism, literature played a huge social role. Writers, critics, publicists of the 30s and 40s were not only the spokesmen of the advanced ideas of their time, but also fighters for a new, free life. Curzon wrote about literature and its significance in this era in his work, On the Development of Revolutionary Ideas in Russia. The literature of a people who do not have political freedom is the only tribune from which he can make him hear the cry of his indignation and his conscience. Tsarism brutally persecuted advanced writers and poets. Tsarist censorship etched out the slightest hint of criticism of the existing system. Created in 1849, The censorship committee banned many books and journals that did not agree with the direction of the official nationality. Tsarism was not limited to pursuing literary activity of writers. Curzon wrote about the tragic fate of the foremost people of Nicholas I and gave a brief but expressive list of the crimes of the Nikolaev monarchy against Russian writers and poets. Ryleyev was hanged by Nikolai. Pushkin was killed in a duel, 38 years. Griboyedov was killed in Tehran. Lermontov was killed in a duel, in the Caucasus. Venovitinov was killed by society, 22 years old. Koltsov was killed by his family, 33 years old. Belenskaya was killed, 35 years old, by hunger and poverty. Barotinsky died after 12 years of exile. The outstanding work of Russian fiction, Woe from Wit by Griboyedov, 1795-1829, was a bright satire on the noble nobility, the ruling bureaucracy, the arrogant military. The comedy, Woe from Wit, played a large public role. Belenskaya wrote that, Woe from Wit was learned in the manuscript by whole Russia. On the question posed at the investigation to the Decembrist Steingel, which works contributed most to the development of liberal views in it, Steingel, along with the works of Voltaire and Radishchev, called Woe from Wit forbidden by the Tsarist censorship. This work has been handwritten in the manuscript for a long time, copied and distributed in the provinces. Griboyedov was all the more dangerous for Tsarism, that he was in contact with the Decembrists, although he did not fully share their views. That's why Nicholas I decided to get rid of Griboyedov. He sent the poet, contrary to his wish, as ambassador to Tehran, where a wonderful Russian playwright was soon killed by a fanatical crowd. A talented Russian writer-philosopher Pyotr Yakovlevich Chaodayev, 1796-1856, a friend of Pushkin, who devoted 3 remarkable epistles to Chaodayev, was a victim of the reign of Nikolaev's reign. In 1836, the famous philosophical letter by Chaodayev was published in the journal Telescope with sharp criticism of autocracy and serfdom in Russia. However, in his criticism Chaodayev made the biggest mistakes. He depicted in a gloomy light the entire historical past of Russia, seeing nothing positive in it, and attributed all the achievements of Russian culture to the influence of the West. Having read the criticism of the autocracy in the article of Chaodayev, Nicholas I wrote, having read the article, I find that the content of this is a mixture of daring nonsense worthy of the insane. After this, the Tsar declared Chaodayev to be insane and ordered him to establish constant medical supervision and to take all his manuscripts. Nicholas I ordered to give soldiers a talented young poet Pelagiev, who wrote the poem, Sashka. Tortured by severe beatings, Pelagiev died in a soldier's hospital. But the most tragic and hard for Russia was the death of the brilliant poet Alexander Pushkin, the greatest Russian poet, the genius of world literature, the founder of Russian realism, the creator of the Russian literary language, as Pushkin is the pride and glory of the Russian people. Pushkin was a nobleman, but, according to the just comment of the great proletarian writer Gorky, for him the interests of the whole nation were above the interests of one nobility, and his personal experience is wider and deeper than the experience of the nobility class. Pushkin was not only a brilliant poet, but also a great citizen, reflecting to a certain extent the revolutionary aspirations of the people. Pushkin was born in 1799 in Moscow, in a noble but impoverished noble family. Thanks to the petition of his uncle and father's friends, Pushkin found himself in the newly founded aristocratic Tsarskoye Selo Lyceum. In his youth, Pushkin admired Russian folk poetry and read the works of the French encyclopedists. In them he was especially attracted by the love of enlightenment and the critical attitude towards the obsolete feudal order. Through revolutionary writers and poets of Russia and Western Europe, Pushkin became acquainted with literature exposing tyrants. Already in 1815, in a poem, To Licinius, the 16-year-old Pushkin wrote about hatred of slavery. In 1817 Pushkin graduated from the Lyceum. The gloomy picture of feudal Russia deeply impressed the impressionable mind of the young poet. Following the example of Radishchev, he created an ode and gave her the same name as Radishchev, the name, Liberty. As Radishchev saw in his dreams that he will rise up everywhere with arms, with the hope of all arm, and will raise the king on the block, so Pushkin called for an uprising against the Tsar. Rise, fallen slaves! The most arrogant villain! Your throne I hate, your destruction, the death of children I see with cruel joy. In his poems Pushkin attacked the supporters and preachers of the autocracy, branded the temporary Arakcheyev, called the Minister of Education of the reactionary Golitsyn, Enlightenment persecutor, and the inspirer of the reaction of Archimandrite Photius, semi-phonetical, half-platoon, who made his instrument, curse, sword, and cross, and whip. In the poem, The Village, Pushkin painted a wild barony, without feeling, without the law. The revolutionary poems of the genius poet could not go unpunished in the then Russia. Pushkin was exiled to the south. The poet continued to write poetry and poems of freedom-loving content in exile, in Kishinev and in Odessa. From Odessa, the poet was sent to a new exile, to the village of Mikhailivskoye, the estate of his father, and his father was entrusted with the supervision of his son. Here the poet worked on his brilliant work, Eugene Onegin, finished the poem, Gypsies, and created the tragedy, Boris Godunov, about which Benkendorf wrote in a memorandum to the Tsar that, the Tsar's power is presented in awful form. The king agreed with this, and Boris Godunov could not appear in the press for several years. Pushkin was closely associated with the Decembrists, among whom he had many friends, but he did not belong to the secret society of the Decembrists. When, shortly after the execution of the Decembrists, Nicholas I summoned Pushkin from exile and asked him, "What would you do if you were on December 14th in St. Petersburg?" Pushkin replied, "I would join the ranks of the rebels." After this, the Tsar declared himself the only censor of Pushkin and did not let his works go to press. A heavy atmosphere of denunciations, slander, humiliation and persecution arose around Pushkin, which led him to a duel with the adoptive son of the Dutch envoy Dantes in 1837. During the duel, Pushkin was seriously wounded and soon died. The Tsar, knowing about the upcoming duel between Pushkin and Dantes, did not prevent it, since he hoped that it would end for Pushkin tragically, and thanks to this the government would get rid of a dangerous, revolutionary-minded poet. Outraged by the villainous murder, thousands of people came to lead the body of a great national poet. By order of the Tsar, the gendarmes secretly took the poet's body away at night and buried him in the Svyatogorsk monastery, near Pushkin's estate. Another great Russian poet of Nikolaev time, Mikhail Yurievich Lermontov, 1814-1841, in a poignantly indignant poem, toward the death of the poet, branded the inspirers of the murder of Pushkin. For these verses Lermontov was exiled to the Caucasus. In 1841, Lermontov was also killed in a duel. He was only 27 years old. His mighty talent was ruined in its heyday. With her creative depth and artistic lyricism, freedom-loving, rebellious poetry of Lermontov has gained the widest fame. Such works of Lermontov as Hero of Our Time, Mtsirai, Masquerade, Demon and others are used worldwide. Nicholas I met the news of Lermontov's death with the malicious exclamation, "To the dog is the dog's death." The exceptionally difficult conditions of the reign of Nikolaev reverberated in the personal and creative destiny of the great Russian writer Nikolai Vasilyevich Gogol, 1809-1852, who in his brilliant works, The Inspector General, Dead Souls, The Old World Landlords, etc., gave tremendous power, anger and a beating satire picture of the deep decomposition of the local nobility. Dead Souls shook the whole of Russia, wrote about the impression of this work Curzon. Such a charge was necessary for modern Russia. This is a medical history written by a master's hand. Gogol's poetry is a cry of horror and shame, which is emitted by a person who is degraded from vulgar life, when suddenly he notices in his mirror his bared face. The early works of Gogol include Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka, and Taras Bulba, from the cycle Murgarod. Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka brought to Gogol wide literary glory and recognition. These poetic essays on Ukraine were full of beauty, charm and sparkling humor. In them, in the words of Belinsky, a funny comedy, the smile of a young man greeting the beautiful God's world, no less colorful and bright is the historical story Taras Bulba, in which Gogol sings the brutal feats of the Ukrainian Cossacks of the X7th century, who fought against foreign invaders, Poles. Belinsky enthusiastically responded to this tale. These works reflect Gogol, a great romantic artist. In the last years of his life, Gogol's religious and mystical sentiments grew stronger. In 1846, in his book Selected Places from Correspondence with Friends, Gogol openly came up with the reactionary idea of justifying and protecting the monarchy and serfdom. The appearance of this book caused a sharp protest from all the advanced people of Russia, headed by Belinsky. The remarkable works of art of the era were brilliant works of Herzog. Past in Thoughts is a true chronicle of the life not only of Herzog but also of the best progressive people of his time, showing the development of Russian social thought in the face of the gloomy Nicholas reaction. The hero of the novel Herzog, who was to blame, an honest, talented, courageous Vladimir Baltov, could not find a place in life. He turned into a superfluous man, a typical image of the classical literature of the XIX century. Russian literature of the first half of the XIX century inextricably linked itself with the socio-political life of the country. She was imbued with the progressive ideas of her time, took the path of artistic realism, ending with temporary hobbies, sentimentalism and romance. The founders of the school of artistic realism were the great Russian writers as Pushkin, as Griboyedov, N. V. Gogol and I. A. Krylov. Artistic works of these writers are immortal. They not only faithfully and vividly reflected the life of their time, they are full of hot faith in the better future of the great Russian people. Our country deeply reveres the memory of its great writers and poets. People's poet Pushkin is the favorite poet of the peoples of the Soviet Union. The prophecy of the great poet who wrote shortly before his death in the wonderful poem Monument was justified, and for a long time I will be so kind to the people that I have been aroused by the kind feelings I liar, that in my cruel age I glorified freedom and mercy to the fallen called art. Deeply progressive ideas of national self-consciousness, national pride of the people awakening to public life, found their reflection in art. Like literature, art became realistic. Under Nicholas I, a special patronage was enjoyed by battle painting, depicting military life, battles, etc. The most necessary in such paintings was the exact reproduction of the forms of clothing, ammunition and all the differences between regiments and arms. The representative of the official academic painting was the artist K. P. Bryalov, 1799-1852. In 1834, his painting The Last Day of Pompeii was exhibited. The success of this picture was enormous, and was The Last Day of Pompeii, for the Russian Brush the First Day, wrote about this picture one of the modern poets. The success of this picture was the result not only of high artistic skill, but also a large number of light and colorful effects, fire, lightning, that made a great impression on the audience. The search for realism found its expression in the work of a major Russian artist A. A. Ivanov. Ivanov worked more than 20 years on his painting The Appearance of Christ to the People. One of the first realist artists was A. Venetsianov. Son merchant Pies, Venetsianov from childhood observed the life of workers, artisans, peasants. This contributed to the realistic direction of his work. His big picture Gumno and the number of sketches from the village life still embellish reality, but the very idea of depicting peasants on the canvas was bold by that time. In late 1840, he exhibited his first picture of a wonderful painter, Genre painter Fedotov. For the painting matchmaking major, Academy of Arts awarded Fedotov the title of academician. The zealots of classical traditions in painting treated with scorn the pictures of Fedotov, as written in the national spirit. Of the portraitists, the most talented were the painter from Surfstropanen, who painted successful portraits of Karamzin and Pushkin, and the subtle romantic artist Kypriansky, famous for his remarkable portraits of Krylov, Pushkin and self-portraits. A prominent Russian architect of the early XX century was A. Voronekin. He built the Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg, one of the best monuments of the newest church architecture in Russia. The founder of Russian opera and symphonic music M.I. Glinka, 1809–1857, used the richness of folk melodies and the experience of classical music of other countries. Glinka approved the global significance of Russian national art. The basis of creativity Glinka, a deep ideological realism and nationality. The Russian aristocracy greeted Glinka's works with hostility, condemning the national storehouse of his music. His brilliant national patriotic opera Ivan Suzin, whose music was called kutchers by the ruling classes, was also not understood. Glinka's classical opera Ruslan and Lyudmila, which reveals new images of Russian fairy tales in a new way, was removed from the repertoire 1 year after its production, and was never renewed during the composer's lifetime. Glinka used in his work Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Finnish, Polish, Georgian, Spanish and other tunes. Do not wait. VSH, Vona fell asleep. The King Mikola II sent a shab shake the hog of the Otok Stelit, that good to extinguish the union, that I go in wake. In 1812 the writer Kvitkos Novianenko organized the first permanent Ukrainian troupe in Poltava. The musical theater, which put the first Ukrainian operas, Nadalka Poltavka, Kotlyarevsky, Swatania on Gonkar 1 VSH Kvitky, Zaporozh hits for the Danube by Gulak Artemovsky, etc., became very popular in Ukraine. The Ukrainian folk songs were based on Ukrainian music. Many Russian composers, for example Glinka, also used Ukrainian folk songs. Culture of the peoples of Transcaucasia. In the first half of the XX century, the intensive development of the national literature of the peoples of Georgia, Armenia and Azerbaijan began. One of the largest Georgian poets of the early XX century was a contemporary of Pushkin Chavchavadze, an aristocrat by birth. Alexander Chavchavadze was one of the first representatives of Romanticism in Georgian poetry. His works are imbued with deep sorrow, caused by the enslavement of Georgia by Russian Tsarism. The most talented representative of Romanticism in Georgian literature was Nikolai Baratashvili, whose works sounded pessimistic and at the same time protested against the heavy Georgian reality. Nikolai Baratashvili is called the Georgian Byron. The founder of the realistic trend in Georgian literature was Georgy Aristavy. Despite his princely origin, Aristavy opposed serfdom in Georgia. George Aristavy was the largest playwright of Georgia in the first half of the XX century, and one of the initiators and active organizers of the Georgian drama theater in Tiflis. The grave situation and struggle of the peasantry of Georgia was portrayed by Daniel Konkadze, who himself emerged from serf peasants. He was the first to speak in Georgian literature against serfdom in the story, The Suram Fortress, published in 1859. The Georgian people enjoyed this story very popular and had a strong influence on the later Georgian revolutionary literature. The national awakening of Armenia, torn to pieces by Turkey, Iran and Russia, begins with a special force after 1828-1829. Of the areas left behind by Iran and Turkey, many Armenian emigrants moved to Russia. The center of the ideological and political life of the emerging Armenian bourgeoisie was Tiflis, where Armenians played a large economic role. Khachatur Abavian was a great writer in Armenia. Abavian's remarkable novel The Wounds of Armenia, on the plot of the Russo-Iranian War, played a major role in the history of Armenian national literature, initiating a new literary language. Household and content, patriotic in mood, novel bright colors depicted the plight of Armenians under Iranian rule. Even before the appearance in the press, the novel was distributed in manuscripts, was read in circles and promoted the awakening of the national consciousness of the Armenian people. Ababian was educated in Derbt, Yuriev University. He was the enemy of the reactionary Armenian clergy and opened the first secular school in Armenia. Appreciating the advanced Russian culture, Ababian was a supporter of ideological and political rapprochement with Russia. Together with his associates, Ababian acquainted the Armenian readers with the best works of Russian and Western European literature. In the first half of the XX century, there is a flowering of new Azerbaijani literature. Its founder Mirza Akhundov, 1812-1878, one of the best writers of his time. Akhundov was educated in a Russian school. His literary work was greatly influenced by Russian literature. Akhundov wrote an elegy to Pushkin's death, in which he spoke of his love for the deceased poet. He was nicknamed the Muslim Molière. In his comedies, he ruthlessly scourged the clergy, exposing his hypocrisy and self-interest. In the comedy, The Alchemist Molla Ibrahim Khalil. In the Turkic literature, Akhundov first sharply opposed women's lawlessness, demanded bourgeois reforms and advocated the Enlightenment and Europeanization of Azerbaijan. Akhundov strove to simplify the Turkic language and proposed reform of the Arabic-Turkish alphabet. Chapter She Bourgeois Reforms. Of the 60th years 45. Preparation of the peasant reform. Fighting around the peasant reform. During the Crimean War, a new emperor entered the throne, Alexander II, from 1855 to 1881. Even as an heir, he declared himself a supporter of the preservation of serfdom and a defender of the interests of the nobility. However, already in the first years of the reign, Alexander II had to take the path of bourgeois reforms, and first of all on the path to the abolition of serfdom. These reforms were caused by the entire course of Russia's economic development. By the middle of the XX century, fully revealed the economic disadvantage of bonded serf labor both in industry and in agriculture. Further development of the productive forces in the country was impossible without the abolition of serfdom. The whole of the urgency of bourgeois transformations in the country, the need for a decisive abolition of serfdom was shown by the Crimean War. Finally, the tremendous growth of peasant unrest, especially during the Crimean War, spoke of a deep crisis in the country and demanded the elimination of the main cause of this crisis, serfdom. The peasant movement in connection with the Crimean War began to take formidable dimensions. Peasant farming during the war fell into decay, and the landowners intensified the exploitation of serfs. The class struggle between peasants and landowners after the Crimean War has reached great acuity. In 1858, the 3rd Department registered 86 unrest, in 909, 90 and in 1860, 108. These disturbances were directed against the whole system of serfdom, and not against individual landowners, as before. The peasants everywhere refused to bear corvée, pay the obsequies, resisting the authorities and military units sent to suppress the population. A revolutionary situation was created in the country. But the peasant movement did not develop into a revolution. A people who for hundreds of years was in slavery to the landlords, was not able to rise up to a broad, open, conscious struggle for freedom. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 17, p. The working class was still in its infancy and could not lead the peasantry to storm the autocracy and serfdom. The mass peasant struggle caused the revival of the bourgeois liberal movement. The liberal landlords and the bourgeoisie openly spoke of the need to abolish serfdom. They submitted notes to the government, wrote letters to the Tsar, drafted reforms, delivered speeches at private gatherings, lunches and banquets. The liberal bourgeoisie and landowners also criticized the feudal state apparatus with its bribery, arbitrariness, arbitrary rule of the authorities, censorship, etc. The threat of a peasant revolution compelled the government to begin preparing for peasant reform. Even the Tsar and the serf-owning landowners, on which he relied, became evident the need to abolish serfdom. In 1856, Alexander II announced this to the nobles of the Moscow province: "The existing order of possession of souls cannot remain unchanged. It is better to abolish serfdom from above, rather than wait for the time, as it by itself begins to be cancelled from below." In 1857, 1858 years, provincial nobility committees were organized to draft reform projects on the abolition of serfdom. The projects worked out by these committees were sent to St. Petersburg in the editorial commissions set up by the government, which were to draft a general reform bill. The commissions consisted of government officials appointed by the government. The chairman of the editorial commissions was appointed reactionary General Rostovtsev, who knows that he once told Nicholas I to the Decembrists. After the death of Rostovtsev, the chairman of the commissions was appointed ardent reactionary Count Panin. The main figure in preparing the reform was Nikolai Milutin, a representative of the liberal bureaucracy. The whole preparation for the reform was directed by the Main Committee on Peasant Affairs, composed of high-ranking officials and large feudal landowners. The bureaucratic preparation of the reform bill lasted for several years, 1857, 1860. The large landowners, in whose hands nearly half of the serfs were concentrated, offered to liberate the peasants without a field allotment with only the estate, while preserving forever their obligation, that is, forced labor on the landowner. The middle-class nobles were interested in the bourgeois development of agriculture. These landlords, who constituted half the nobility, owned most of the serfs. Among them there were two main groups: owners of corvée and owners of quit-rent estates. Their interests were different. Obligation prevailed in non-black soil regions, in which income was brought not so much by land as by the possession of serfs. The landlords released their serfs for quit-rent, who went to factories or to separate trades. Therefore, for example, the Ver landlords proposed to release the peasants from the land, but for a considerable ransom, including in it the ransom of the serf peasant, the Yankovsky project. For the landlords of the Chernozem strip, on the contrary, the main value was represented by the fertile land on which they conducted the corvée farming. In an effort to keep the land in their hands, and to liberate the liberated peasants into farm laborers, the owners of corvée estates demanded the release of peasants without land. This was the project of the Poltava landlords. The government, fearing a general uprising of the peasants, stood for empowering the peasants with a small allotment with a ransom at a high price. No matter how different the interests of different landlord groups were, it was still a struggle within the same class. Both the feudalists and the liberals were equally interested in preventing the peasant revolution, and by peaceful means, at the cost of concessions and agreements, turning the Russian countryside towards a gradual bourgeois transformation with the preservation of power and land in the hands of the landlords. This way was done by the Prussian landowners, the Junkers, who ensured the slow evolution of their large feudal farms into bourgeois ones. In Prussia, with the abolition of serfdom, the landlords deprived the peasants of their land in their favor. Almost landless peasants had to go to work for the landlords as farm laborers on enslaving conditions and sell the remaining pieces of land to the kulaks. The farm laborers in Prussia were powerless and were governed by the landowners on the basis of the Statute of Servants. This way of developing capitalism in agriculture, under which the economic and political domination of the landowners is preserved, Lenin called Prussian. It was for this Prussian way of capitalist development that the Russian liberals wanted to lead agriculture. The Russian peasants spontaneously, but persistently fought for the revolutionary path, for the division of large landed estates and for a decisive cleansing of the land of the remnants of feudalism, as it was in America. After the abolition of slavery in the United States, capitalism began to develop rapidly in agriculture. In place of plantation slave-holding farms and on free lands taken from the Indians, capitalist farms developed. Due to the complete absence of feudal survivals, the relations between farmers and agricultural workers had a clearly expressed character of the class relations of capitalists and proletarians. The newly organized American farms used machines and artificial fertilizers. This way of development of capitalism in agriculture Lenin called the American way of development. N.G. Chernyshevsky, 1828-1889. Peasants, most interested in the abolition of serfdom, were completely eliminated from participating in the preparation of the reform. Nikolai Gavrilovich Chernyshevsky, a great Russian democratic writer and great socialist of the pre-Marxist period, as Lenin called it, defended the interests of serfs with a program of revolutionary democracy. Nikolai Gavrilovich Chernyshevsky was born in Saratov, in the family of a priest. He received his education first in the theological seminary, and then at the St. Petersburg University. Chernyshevsky hated the Tsarist autocracy, which oppressed the Russian people. As a young man, he sought from the revolutionary writers of Russia and the West to answer the questions that tormented him about the reorganization of society. Chernyshevsky became a socialist, but his socialism was still pre-Marxist, utopian. Chernyshevsky learned the advanced historical and philosophical teachings of his time and substantiated his original philosophical theory, the materialist philosophy of Russian revolutionary democracy. As a utopian socialist, Chernyshevsky assumed that the peasant land community that existed at that time would enable Russia to go directly to socialism, bypassing capitalism. But in order for the community to fulfill this role, Chernyshevsky said, the peasants, upon liberation, should receive a sufficient amount of land. Chernyshevsky could not yet foresee that only the development of capitalism and the proletariat will create through the class struggle of workers the possibility of the victory of socialism. He could not, or rather, because of the backwardness of Russian life, could not rise to the dialectical materialism of Marx and Engels. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 14, p. 346. Chernyshevsky expounded his socialist views in detail in the novel What Is to Be Done, written by him during his imprisonment in the Peter and Paul fortress. But Chernyshevsky was not only a utopian socialist, wrote Lenin about him. He was also a revolutionary democrat. He was able to influence all the political events of his epoch in a revolutionary spirit, conducting, through obstacles and slingshots of censorship, the idea of a peasant revolution, the idea of the struggle of the masses to overthrow all the old authorities. Lenin, SOCH, v. 17, p. 97. The pupil and successor of the great revolutionary enlightener Belinsky, Chernyshevsky from 1853 became an employee, and then the actual head of the journal, Contemporary. This magazine he turned into an organ of revolutionary democracy. In his articles on the peasant question in the Contemporary, Chernyshevsky elaborated the program of the peasant revolution in detail. He demanded the complete abolition of serfdom without redemption, personal freedom and free transfer to the peasants of the whole earth. Chernyshevsky closely followed the course of the reform and showed that the liberation prepared by Tsarism was in reality deception and robbery of the peasants. He especially exposed the liberals who entered into a deal with the Imperial Party. Chernyshevsky said that whoever liberated the peasants, landowners, serfs or liberals, still, will turn out to be an abomination. Chernyshevsky urged the peasants to revolution. Nado Rylyubov, 1836-1861. Together with Chernyshevsky for the peasant revolution fought his political like-minded people, Dobrolubov and Nekrasov, who worked in the editorial board of Sovremennik. Especially sharply they scourged the betrayal of the liberals. Nado Rylyubov is a revolutionary democrat, a great Russian critic. In his critical articles, he revealed the socio-political significance of progressive works of art, defending realistic art and its social orientation. Like Chernyshevsky, Dobrolubov was a supporter and follower of materialistic philosophy. In the articles, What is Oblomovism? When will the real day come? The Dark Kingdom. He branded the landlord society and autocratic state. In his satirical poems, Dobrolyubov sharply exposed and scourged the betrayal of Russian liberals. These poems were printed in a satirical application to the contemporary, called Whistle. Dobrolyubov died of tuberculosis at the age of 25, in the heyday of his enormous literary talent. His strength was shattered by his feverish, tireless work. In the poem, In Memory of Dobrolyubov, Nekrasov wrote, "What lamp of reason has died away? What a heartbeat stopped?" Na Nekrasov, 1821-1877. The activities of the great Russian poet Na Nekrasov also took place during a peasant struggle against serfdom. Nekrasov was the son of a landowner, but even in his childhood he was imbued with hatred for serfdom. He broke with his father serf and lived in hard material conditions, wandering around the St. Petersburg corners where the poor lived. In the early 40s, Nekrasov approached the literary circle Belinsky and from 1846 began to publish the magazine, Contemporary. This militant organ of the then revolutionary democracy. The leading position in the journal was occupied by Belinsky. The goals of working together with Belinsky had a decisive influence on Nekrasov. In the late 1950s, Nekrasov broke with his former westernizers, moderate liberals, and joined the ranks of determined fighters for the peasant revolution. Nekrasov was a singer of a heavy peasant share. His muse of revenge and sorrow scourged the landlord feudal Russia and called for a struggle for the better life of the people. Revolutionary Raznikintsy 60s. The struggle of the peasants for land and freedom was supported by the revolutionary movement of the democratic, diverse intelligentsia, who replaced the nobility revolutionaries. Raznoshinsy called digi-Philistines, petty officials, the lower strata of the clergy, ruined noblemen. The situation on February 19 caused deep indignation among Democrats. Raznikintsy. In the summer and especially in the fall of 1861, St. Petersburg and Kazan students held demonstrations. The frightened authorities saw in this youth speech the beginning of the revolution. To suppress the students of St. Petersburg University, who were gathering for meetings, military force was used. About 300 students were arrested and sent to the Kronstadt fortress. But the revolutionary mood after that has increased more. Among the youth, secret revolutionary circles began to be created for the struggle against Tsarism. Leaders of the revolutionary movement Raznikintsy Democrats were Chernyshevsky and Dobrolyubov. The ideological organizing center of this movement was the journal Sovremennik, directed by Chernyshevsky. The powerful revolutionary preaching of the great Democrat writer raised the best people of the 60s in the struggle against feudal autocracy. In 1861, from the circle of Chernyshevsky, a proclamation to the peasantry from their well-wishers' abode was written in simple folk language. The proclamation exposed the Tsar's deal with the landlords and called upon the peasants to prepare together for the uprising against the Tsar and the landowners in a friendly and organized manner. At the same time, Chernyshevsky's friend Envy Shelgunov wrote a proclamation to the soldiers. Both of these proclamations were not printed, since they were included in the third section in the manuscript. From the revolutionary circle, Chernyshevsky also issued a proclamation to the younger generation, written by Envy Shelgunov and printed in the London printing house Curzon. This proclamation urged the youth to conduct revolutionary agitation among peasants and soldiers. For the dissemination of this proclamation, the famous poet Mikhail Mikhailov was arrested and exiled to hard labor. In the spring of 1862, a proclamation, Young Russia, was issued in Moscow, written by student revolutionary Zakhnovsky. Like Shelgunov, Zakhnovsky saw in the revolutionary youth the main force of the revolution. He warmly urged the youth to armed uprising and the destruction of the ruling classes. In the early 60s, 1861, 1863 was organized the first major revolutionary secret society, Land and Freedom. The initiative for its creation belonged to a group of writers close to the magazine Sovremennik, The revolutionary Democrats Serno Solovyevich, Obrachev, Sleptsov, and others, who were members of the Chernyshevsky Circle. Chernyshevsky was the ideological inspirer and leader of the entire revolutionary democratic movement in the country during the preparation and implementation of peasant reform. The Tsarist government, with the help of a whole system of provocations and forgery, organized Chernyshevsky's trial and accused him, without proof, of writing the proclamation to the bearish peasants and, most importantly, of adherence to materialistic and revolutionary ideas. Having held Chernyshevsky for 2 years in the Peter and Paul fortress, the government sentenced this irreconcilable fighter against the autocracy, the leader of the peasant revolution, to 14 years of hard labor and to an eternal settlement in Siberia. Before committing to penal servitude, on May 19, 1864, a medieval ceremony of civil execution was performed over Chernyshevsky. On Midninsky Square in St. Petersburg, the executioners erected Chernyshevsky on the scaffold, put him on his knees, broke his sword over his head, and then fastened them to the pillory with chains. Chernyshevsky calmly stood in the rain, waiting for the end of these bullying. When Chernyshevsky was taken from the scaffold, one girl threw him flowers. She was immediately arrested. Chernyshevsky was sent to Nurkinsk penal servitude. When the term of hard labor, shortened to 7 years, was over, Chernyshevsky, under the special order of Alexander II, was again put in prison in the remote Siberian town of Vilyuisk. In 1883, he was transferred from Vilyui prison to Astrakhan, and only 27 years after his arrest, in 1889, when Chernyshevsky was already 61, was allowed to return to his hometown of Saratov. Exhausted by prison and exile, N.G. Chernyshevsky died in Saratov in October 1889. The great Russian revolutionary Democrat Chernyshevsky spent almost half his life in captivity in a fortress, in a convict prison, in the Vilyui jail and in exile. Thus took revenge on Tsarism to its irreconcilable enemy. N.G. Chernyshevsky was a great Russian patriot who gave his whole life to his country and his native people. Especially in his youth, Chernyshevsky wrote, "To promote the glory of not being passing through, but of its eternal homeland and the good of humanity, what can be higher and more desirable than this?" Until the end of his life he selflessly served this task. Chernyshevsky was a great democratic scientist, a hot propagandist of scientific knowledge. Marx and Engels considered him to be a major Russian scientist. They wrote that Chernyshevsky's economic works make Russia's real honor. Lenin called Chernyshevsky a remarkably profound critic of capitalism. Chernyshevsky was, moreover, a literary critic and one of the founders of the materialist theory of aesthetics. The books of Chernyshevsky after his conviction were seized by the Tsarist authorities. The revolutionaries of the 40s-60s, Belinsky, Curzon, Chernyshevsky, Dobrolyubov, Pisarev, etc. Lenin called enlighteners, as they contributed to the political education of Russia through their literary activities. At a time when the working class of Russia was just emerging and therefore did not yet act as an advanced revolutionary force, the Enlightenmentists were fighters against the Tsarist autocracy and serfdom. Zemsky, city, judicial and military reforms. After the abolition of serfdom, Tsarism was compelled to carry out other bourgeois reforms, the purpose of which was to adapt the autocratic police system of Russia to the needs of bourgeois development. In the elected Zemstvos and city dumas created by the government, representatives of the bourgeoisie and the peasantry were allowed, besides representatives of the nobility. Lenin wrote about the Zemstvo and city duma that it was the beginning of the local representative institutions of the bourgeoisie. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 15, p. 308. In 1864, Zemstvos, county and provincial, were created. The Zemstvos were local government bodies, which controlled purely local affairs concerning the rural population, roads, the establishment of hospitals, schools, etc. The county and provincial zemstvo assemblies, which consisted of elective zemstvo vals, elected their executive organs, the county and provincial zemstvo councils, headed by the chairman from the nobleman landlords. The election of the vals in the zemstvos was carried out on the basis of the land qualification, which was entirely given to the zemstvo by large landowners. The district zemstvo vals were chosen by the landowners and peasants, as well as the property townspeople, that is, the bourgeoisie. The plenipotentiaries, elected at village gatherings, elected the vals from the peasants. Under the pressure of the administration, the peasants were usually forced to choose the kulaks, that is, the rural bourgeoisie, as vals. Provincial vals were chosen by the district zemsky assemblies. Zemstvo councils and the chairman of the council were elected at zemstvo meetings and approved by the governor. The zemstvo was led by noble landowners in their class interests. This was particularly evident in the fact that the peasants paid zemstvo taxes for 1/10 of the land, twice as much as the landlords. In the interests of the landlords, roads were built and medical stations near the estates were arranged. Before the zemstvo reform, there were no good local roads at all, and there were bad country roads. Roads conducted zemstvos, contributed to the growth of capitalism. Zemstvos in the 70s engaged in the conduct of railways, the establishment of banks, which also contributed to the development of capitalism. All activities of zemstvos as elected organizations were under constant supervision of governors. Despite the fact that the autonomy of the zemstvo institutions was severely limited, nevertheless zemstvos developed useful activities among peasants in the field of public education, healthcare, the dissemination of agronomic knowledge, etc. In zemstvo schools and hospitals, many advanced people work to achieve the benefit of the people. For example, in the field of public education, Ilya Nikolaevich Ulyanov, the father of Lenin, worked. Zemsky hospitals worked as a doctor Russian writer A.P. Chekhov. The Tsarist government, having created zemstvo institutions, was afraid of expanding the activities of these institutions and sought to limit them in every possible way. Lenin gave a vivid description of the situation of the zemstvo institutions and their real role. Zemstvo from the very beginning, Lenin wrote, was condemned to be the fifth wheel in the cart of Russian government, a wheel permitted by the bureaucracy only insofar as its absolute power was not violated, and the role of deputies from the population was limited to bare practice, simple technical execution of the circle of tasks outlined by the same bureaucracy, and, having made such an innocuous concession, the government on the very next day after 6 zemstvos adopt a systematic constraint and limit it. Omnipotent bureaucratic clique could not coexist with an elected Vsislavnia representation, and Vera began strongly. And Lenny, Works, Volume 5, page 32, in 1870, instead of the city's 6 domed city councils established under Catherine II, city dumas were created, consisting of urban vals, chosen by homeowners, merchants, factory owners and other large payers of city taxes. City councils were in the hands of the bourgeoisie and acted in its class interests. This was clearly expressed in the absence of improvement in those neighborhoods where the urban poor lived. The City Duma elected its executive body, the city government headed by the city head. The activities of the city councils were also under the supervision of the governor. In 1864, the court reform was also carried out. The former, pre-reform, feudal court, with complete lack of publicity, was replaced by a new, bourgeois court. Court hearings began to occur publicly. The judicial investigation was carried out at the very hearing of the court. In the decision of criminal cases in district courts began to take part the jurymen from the nobility, from the urban and rural bourgeoisie. They determined the guilt or innocence of the defendants. The accused were defended by lawyers. The prosecution supported the prosecution. For the analysis of petty cases, a world court was established. City councils and zemstvos elected justices of the peace from the big landowners and homeowners. in the village was organized specifically for the Zemstvo lunch. From the picture of Gigi Myasoidov, the analysis of peasant affairs is the estate peasant rural court, which could subject the peasants to corporal punishment. Civil cases were also decided in public with the participation of the parties, i.e. representatives of the plaintiff and the defendant. For the civil court, laws were issued that protected property for the tools and means of production of both landlords and capitalists. Judicial reform was conducted by the government on the model of the West European bourgeois court and was the most bourgeois of the reforms of the 60s, as new courts protected the interests of the bourgeoisie. Political cases were examined by the chambers and the Senate, as well as military courts. More often, political affairs were resolved in an administrative order. Arrested revolutionaries referred to Siberia or to the north of Russia without investigation and trial. In 1874, the Tsarist government conducted a military reform. Instead of recruiting, a universal conscription service was introduced. Young people, who reached the age of 21, were on call. Some of the conscripts were enlisted in the military service, and part, according to marital status, remained in reserve. The service life was set at 6 years, after which the soldier was credited to the reserve. For those who received education, i.e., predominantly for the landlords and the bourgeoisie, the service life was greatly reduced. While protecting the interests of the landlords, the bourgeois reforms of the 60s at the same time opened wide the way for the development of capitalism in Russia. Tsarist Russia was making its first steps towards becoming a bourgeois monarchy. In the cold, from the picture of V.G. Perros, having carried out bourgeois reforms against the rule of the 60s, Tsarism, however, did not refuse to continue its reactionary policy. Especially strongly expressed government reaction in the matter of education. In 1871, at the suggestion of the Minister of Education, the reactionary Count de Tolstoy, classical gymnasiums were established with the teaching of ancient languages, Latin and Greek, as the main subject. The teaching of natural science was completely destroyed in gymnasiums, and the teaching of mathematics and the Russian language was greatly reduced. Over the people's Zemstvo schools, as well as over the people's teachers, police supervision of the inspectors of public schools was established. 47. Revolution of 1863 in Poland. Poland on the eve of the uprising. In the middle of the XX century, Poland experienced an economic and social upsurge. The development of capitalism has greatly stepped forward. Large factories grew. The factory and factory centers developed. Warsaw, Gerardov, Lodz. The Dąbrowski Carboniferous region quickly developed. In agriculture, Polish landlords cultivated technical crops, distillers and beetroot for the sugar industry. In the 1950s, the agrarian question sharply aggravated in Poland. Polish peasants were deprived of land even when freed from serfdom. In 1807, peasant land shortage caused a massive withdrawal of peasants to the city for work, especially increased in the 50s-60s. The industrial crisis of the early 1960s led to the closure of many factories and plants. Therefore, unemployment has greatly increased. The revolutionary moods were growing among the Polish workers and peasants. At the same time, the revolutionary movement among the Polish gentry and the developing bourgeoisie, which was burdened by its dependent position from Tsarist Russia, intensified. The defeat of Tsarism in the Crimean War further strengthened the revolutionary movement in Poland. In 1861-1862 years, in Poland, a broad national movement unfolded. Demonstrative requiems for the leaders of the Polish uprising of 1831 were organized. On the streets of Warsaw there were patriotic demonstrations. Some of them ended in the execution of the demonstrators by the Tsarist troops, which caused even greater bitterness and hatred of the Poles towards Tsarism. In 1862, the Central People's Committee was formed in Warsaw. A revolutionary organization, the so-called Red Party, was grouped around this committee. This party consisted of representatives of the small-scale ruined gentry and the petty bourgeoisie. At the same time, the political organization of the Polish landowners, the so-called White Party, also acted. Between the Reds and Whites there was a fierce struggle for leadership of the insurrection, as well as for the nature of the uprising, its program and tactics. The Tsarist government, in time to withdraw the revolutionary elements of Poland, included urban youth in the list of emergency recruitment. Avoiding recruitment, the revolutionary youth fled from cities to the forests and created partisan detachments there. Workers and artisans took an active part in these detachments. The rise of 1863. In January 1863, after the publication of the decree on recruitment, insurrections broke out at 15 points in Poland. The Central People's Committee, John Narodowy, who led them, declared itself a revolutionary government and proclaimed a struggle for an independent Polish state. For 15 months in Warsaw there was an underground revolutionary government of Poland. At the end of January 1863, this government issued a manifesto on the transfer to the peasants of those landed estates, which had previously been used by peasants. At the same time, an order was issued to organize the people's militia. Polish peasants enthusiastically went to partisan detachments. However, the new government, mostly gentry, was frightened of the peasant war, abolished the call to the people's militia and invited the peasants to go home. By this counter-revolutionary measure, the insurrection was weakened. The Polish nobles placed all their hopes on the intervention of Napoleon III and other states in defense of Poland. But they have not received the promised support either from France or from Austria. Alexander II concluded an agreement with the Prussian king on the joint suppression of the Polish insurrection and, having collected a huge army, moved it to subdue the insurgent Poland. The uprising from Poland was transferred to Lithuania, Belarus and neighboring regions of Ukraine. In Vilna, the Lithuanian-Belarusian Red Jund was formed to lead the uprising. Here, as in Poland, the gentry elements of the government hampered the movement. The peasants of Lithuania and Belarusia, armed with scythes and axes, opposed the landlords, both Russian and Polish. The organizer and leader of the peasant uprising in Belarus was Kostas Kalinowski. Agriculture after the reform. The reform of 1861 preserved the basis of the economic backwardness of agriculture. The landlord's latifundia, that is, the largest estates in which the semi-feudal economy dominated. The shortage of land for the peasants after the abolition of serfdom, as well as the the absence of land, the severity of Tsarist taxes, forced the peasants to rent from the landowner collection of arrears. From the picture of Pukirev, arable land, pastures and meadows for mowing. For this the peasants had to cultivate their landowner's inventory with their inventory. It was an old feudal serfdom in a new form of workings. Another form of this same corvée was use, in which peasants paid half the harvest in kind to the landowner for the rented land. Taking advantage of the plight of the peasants, landowners and kulaks usually hired laborers in the middle of winter, when most of the peasants already lacked bread. Receiving forward grain or flour in debt or deposit on the basis of extremely insignificant wages, the peasant enslaved himself in the winter to all summer field work. As a result of landlord exploitation, the bulk of the peasantry, poor and middle peasants, was deprived of the opportunity to improve their farming. Receiving huge revenues through the semi-feudal exploitation of the peasants, the landlord's labor economy was very slowly transformed into a capitalist economy. The labor-saving system of the economy still prevailed in the central provinces of Russia, when capitalist agriculture began to develop in the Ukraine and the Volga region. The land of the ruined landlords was bought up by the urban bourgeoisie and kulaks. For 20 years, 1861, 1881, the ruined landlords sold more than 16.5 million acres of land. The natural economy of the peasants turned into small-scale commodity. Peasants were forced to sell bread often at the expense of reducing their own consumption. In the village, Property inequalities increased, and with it the class stratification also grew. From the middle peasantry there was a small rural bourgeoisie, the kulaks. The bulk of the middle peasant mass was ruined and passed into the ranks of village proletarians and semi-proletarians, into a class of wage workers with allotment, as Lenin called them. By the beginning of the 1980s, at least half of all peasant households consisted of a horseless and one-horse poor. Periodically repeated, about every 3 years, crop failures replenished the ranks of the rural poor with the ruined middle peasants. The peasant bourgeoisie, or the kulaks, accumulated its capital by usury and exploitation of the poor peasants. In the autumn, when the time came to pay taxes, poor peasants and middle peasants brought bread for sale, and the prices for bread therefore fell. The kulaks used this and bought cheap bread. But already in January, the poor peasants did not have enough bread. Then the poor man took a grain loan from the kulak, but he had to return 2 sacks or more for a sack of bread in the fall, or else to process a piece of land near the kulak. Often the loan was given from 500–800% per annum. The poor fell into a desperate bondage to the kulak. The kulak also gave the poor bond in his shop and in his tavern. Such predatory exploitation of the peasant poor created the capital of the Golupievs and Razuvievs, as the great Russian satirist Saltykov-Shchedrin called the kulaks. Collected in this way, the capital went either into commerce and industry, or to the development of capitalist agriculture. The FIST widely used hired labor and improved implements of agriculture, plow, harvesting machine, thresher. The abolition of serfdom contributed to the penetration of capitalism and into the Ukrainian village. There also occurred a stratification of the peasantry, and the kulaks were formed. In the steppe Ukraine, kulak farms widely used machines and wage labor. The landlords preferred to rent the land in large lots for rent to the kulaks for several years, and they in turn rented it out in small lots to poor peasants, usually for a year. Thus, the Ukrainian peasant got into double exploitation, the landlord and the kulak. Renting land, the peasant was obliged to give her a certain number of tithes from tithing. It was called a village and was a kind of polish. Sometimes skopchkina reached 3/4 of the crop. Railway. From the picture. VGP Rov. Particularly difficult was the position of the peasants of right bank Ukraine, who, after the abolition of serfdom, were deprived of the opportunity to use forests, waters, pastures. In Belarus, as in the rest of Russia, after the peasant reform, large landed estates predominated, mostly Polish. But the difference from the rest of Russia consisted in the fact that the large landed estates in Belorussia quickly adapted to the new economic order and not only did not decrease, but even grew at the expense of middle and small landowners, turning into a capitalist agricultural enterprise of the Prussian type. The lack of industry and specialties further worsened the situation of the Belarusian peasants. In addition to bondage work in the landed estates, they could find work only in the cutting and rafting of the forest. After the reform, capitalism penetrated into the agriculture of Georgia. In the village, the contradictions between the main mass of the peasantry and the kulaks intensified. The process of stratification of the peasants occurred quite quickly. In a number of counties of Georgia, 80–90% of the total number of sheep was concentrated in the hands of the rural bourgeoisie. Constantly in need of money, the peasants borrowed them from usurers, and the interest went up to 200–300. The Georgian village stood on its way to extinction. One czarist general who was sent to Kakheti to find out the reasons for the peasant unrest, was forced to admit the complete impoverishment of the peasants. "I personally know," he wrote, "a mass of peasant families where members of the family eat bread in a day or two in the course of winter, because there is no bread of their own, and the peasants are interrupted by accidental earnings." In his brilliant work, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, Lenin showed that after 1861 capitalism developed both in the landlord and in the peasant economy. The landlords and the bourgeoisie guided the development of capitalism along the evolutionary path. The peasantry spontaneously fought for the revolutionary path. The development of capitalism and industry. The development of capitalism and industry followed the reform of 1861 at a much faster rate than in agriculture. But for the development of capitalism, good communication routes were necessary, and there were very few of them in serf Russia. Suffice it to say that in 1861 there were only 1,488 versts of railways in the immense Russian Empire. In the first decade after the reform, 2/3 of the capital was invested in railway construction. From 1861 to 1881, over 20 years, 19.5 thousand versts of railroads were built. Around the railway construction in the 60s and 70s unfolded entrepreneurial fever. Receiving from the government a concession, that is, a monopoly on the construction of railways, large officials or landlords resold their concessions for big money to Russian and foreign capitalists. For example, in the 1950s the construction of railways was the monopoly of French capital, which formed the main railway society. At one time this society was put into operation and all existing roads. The textile industry grew especially strongly after 1861. For the years 1861-1881 years, tissue production increased threefold. The large-scale machine industry defeated the manufacturing industry. Weaving mills replaced artisanal weaving. Slower than the textile industry, heavy industry developed. The impetus for its development was provided by railway construction. In 1871, the first blast furnace in Ukraine was blown up in a factory in Yuzovka, now Salino, built on British capital. The southern factories, based mainly on foreign capital, began to manufacture rails and other railway equipment imported before from abroad. For 30 years after the reform, from 1861 to 1890, smelting of pig iron, oil production has grown extremely, almost 10 times. In the 1970s, Ukraine's metallurgy was still making its first steps. At this time, the extraction of hard coal increased considerably. From 1861 to 1881, it increased 15-fold. The leading industries in Ukraine at that time were sugar and distillery. For the distillation of alcohol in the right bank Ukraine, potato cultivation increased in landlord estates. The landowners of right bank Ukraine intensively expanded the planting of sugar beets, which they supplied to sugar refineries. The withdrawal of the Ukrainian peasants to sugar, like leaving the steppe for agricultural work, was at this time the main source of poor peasant earnings. The development of industry in Transcaucasia was rather slow. In Tiflis province there were only small enterprises. The first mechanical plant in Tiflis was founded by the British. In 1865 the first large textile factory was founded. The conduct of the Transcaucasian Railway was of great economic importance for Georgia and the entire Transcaucasus. In 1872 the railway movement between Poti and Tiflis was opened for the first time. Lenin pointed out that the development of capitalism in Russia took place in depth and breadth. The development of capitalism deep into the future meant the further growth of capitalist industry, capitalist agriculture and the growth of the domestic market in the main central territory of Russia. The development of capitalism in breadth meant the spread of the rule of capitalism to new territories, to the colony. Tsarism for the sake of Russian manufacturers and breeders in every possible way prevented the development of industry in the national areas, the colonies. This he saved the market for the products of Russian industry and simultaneously pumped raw materials from the colonies. Lenin emphasized that the development of capitalism was deeper into the interior owing to the colonization of suburbs. The narrowness of the domestic market, due to feudal remnants and poverty of the population, forced foreign markets to seek. If Russian capitalism had no place to expand beyond the territory occupied at the beginning of the post-reform period, then this contradiction between capitalist large-scale industry and archaic institutions in rural life, attachment of peasants to the land, etc., would have had quickly lead to the complete abolition of these institutions, to a complete clearing of the way for agricultural capitalism in Russia. but the opportunity to seek and find a market in the colonized suburbs. For the manufacturer, the opportunity to go to new lands, for the peasant, weakens the severity of this contradiction and slows its resolution. It goes without saying that such a slowdown in the growth of capitalism is tantamount to preparing for an even greater and wider growth of capitalism in the near future. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 3, p. 522. This prediction of Lenin was fully confirmed by the whole further course of Russian history. The growth of the industrial proletariat, along with the development of industry, the industrial proletariat grew. The proletariat was formed from an impoverished peasant mass and urban artisans. In his book The Development of Capitalism in Russia, Lenin showed the process of detachment of the peasant from the land and turning it into a wage worker. The devastation forced the peasants to go to the railways, to new factories and plants. The connection of factory workers to the land weakened year after year. By the 1980s, already for half of all workers in Russia, the factory was the main source of livelihood. The majority of handicrafts people were ruined, either by falling into the clutches of buyers, or by abandoning their handicrafts and entering the factories and plants. All the post-reform 40th anniversary, Lenin wrote, is one continuous process of raskristianivania. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 4, p. 396.